Welcome to Tomorrow Never Knows with me, Bob Wilson, Sir Warren Brown, and our friend and author, Phil Weathers. Today, we welcome a very special guest, Laurence Juber, to the Beatles Kingdom. Lend us your ears and we'll give you a show. And of course, Henry the Horse dances the waltz. But first, we have to go and say a word for our sponsor. Beatles Magazine is a publication with 370 plus million visitors in all their pages, read by thousands of fans around the world each and every day. Beatles news is updated daily, 24 hours, audio, video, photos, interviews, contests, additional materials, and more. So follow Beatles Magazine, the most complete online coverage, 24 hours a day, and how many days a week, guys?
8 days a week.
8 days a week. So we welcome Laurence. Thank you for coming on the show. We're very excited to have you on today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let me get right to it. Can you tell us what Merle Travers and Chet Atkins mean to you as a guitarist? And tell us when you first picked up a guitar and started playing.
Okay, that's two very different subjects.
Okay.
Merle Travers, I started playing guitar when I was 11, in November of 1963, which was kind of right before With the Beatles was released in England. She Loves You had been a hit in August, September. It was, Beatleness was in the air. And it was really kind of the first big wave of Beatlemania in England at that time. My original inspiration to play guitar was not only Beatles, but also the Shadows, the English instrumental band that were also Cliff Richard's backing group. Right. And they were kind of like the English version of the Ventures. They played twangy guitar music. We could have called it surf music, but we didn't have any surf. So for me, it was, I loved playing the guitar. And then right around that same period, 1963, 64, was also the kind of the peak of the folk music scene. There was protest songs were in the air. Bob Dylan, had become very big, and of course there was a lot of finger picking guitar going on with that. And we had in the English folk scene, in the London folk scene, there were Bert Jansch and John Remborn were the two kind of leading fingerstyle guitar players, players that would play solo using their right hand to pick on the guitar in a way that you could hear melody and bass. And I was really intrigued by that. There was their inspiration was a player named Davy Graham, who wrote a piece called Angie. And that piece, Paul Simon recorded a year or so later. And what was cool about it was that it had kind of this moving bass line, but it also had this melody on top. And if you could do the two at the same time, that was a big deal. And it was kind of like a rite of passage. And when I was 13, I'd figured out how to play it. Not long after that, I got a Merle Travis album, which really kind of introduced me to the idea of what technically we refer to as Kentucky thumb picking, with that kind of alternating bass with a strong backbeat to it. I didn't really get into Chet Atkins for many, many years later. Merle Travis was really kind of the first introduction to that, but I was still very much a fan of what in England we call the folk baroque or folk baroque, which really was more like folk Renaissance. I mean, I think it had more in common with Renaissance lute music, Elizabethan music. And as that was kind of part of the folk scene, it also filtered through, for example, into Led Zeppelin's music. There's elements of that in Jimmy Page's playing. And that really was kind of in the just all part of the musical environment that I grew up in. But when I was 13, I realized that I wanted to make a living being a guitar player. And my ambition was to be a studio guitar player, because I learned that that was a great way to make a living and not have to travel and be able to play on records, because not only did I love playing guitar, I also loved the sound of recorded music, of records, and how all the different parts within a record work together, the bass part, the melody, the rhythm guitar parts. And so that was really part of my passion too. So that really became kind of the goal, was to be a studio player.
Well, you mentioned Bob Dylan, and in some things I looked up, before we come on the show, I like to learn more, more than I know about you, and get deeply as possible into it, to try to ask the best questions. And it just seems to me that Bob Dylan had quite an influence on you, and you just mentioned him. A lot of our listeners are big fans of his, and he's been at it before JFK was even president, and he's still touring extensively today. What are your feelings about Bob Dylan, if I can ask?
Oh, I think that's a complicated question, because Bob Dylan is a man of many masks.
Very true.
For me, the really the important Bob Dylan period was those 60s records where you went from, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, Blowing in the Wind, and then, the electrification of Dylan with Like a Rolling Stone and Maggie's Farm, and then he had his motorbike accident and comes back with John Wesley Harding. That progression was a fascinating thing, because when you think about it, and it's true very much with the Beatles music too, how quickly the music developed, how it went from being, on Dylan's end, kind of being the inspired by Woody Guthrie, and then Dylan realizing that he had his own commercial thing that worked, and then him putting out these folk records, and then going through these changes, and then the influence that Dylan had on the Beatles, as far as inspiring John in particular from a lyrical point of view. That I think that a lot of that was really important, and the way in which the interplay happened between Dylan and the Beatles, and then the Beatles influencing the other folk musicians in America, for example, like the Byrds. And so you get this ping pong thing that happens, where Beatles influence the Byrds, who then influence the Beatles, and so on. The same thing happens with the Beach Boys too. It's really kind of a fascinating area, and can go very deep into kind of musicology and Beatlology when you start looking at who influenced who and how.
Well, that was a great answer. I'm glad I snuck that question in. At one point, it looks like, when I tried to figure out when you were starting out, you were a session player, and if I'm correct, you were doing like 3 sessions a day, approximately 7 days a week. I was wondering about that, and how did that eventually later lead to Wings?
Well, because my ambition was to be a studio player, I joined the National Youth Jazz Orchestra, which was really kind of like a farm team for the studio world. And I had I played with them on a TV concert. I got a phone call from a musician's contractor. In England, we call them fixers, who would book players for studio work. And he had seen me on this show, and there was a man named David Katz, and he liked to mentor up and coming players. And so he got me started in studio work, and then it kind of evolved from there, where I met other people and other contractors and artists and arrangers. And eventually it got me to the point where by mid 77, especially, I was just, working all the time. And it might be 8 o'clock in the morning, it might be a jingle session, and then I go over to Olympic Studios at 10 o'clock, and then go to Trident at 2 o'clock, and then be at Abbey Road at 7 o'clock. And half the time I had no idea what it was I was doing. One particular session at Abbey Road was with a string orchestra and some mandolins and a harpsichord and acoustic guitar. And I didn't know until I read 25 years later in a magazine that it was for the Alan Parsons Project. And it was on a track called Pavan on the Tales of Mystery and Imagination album. You just didn't know with a lot of this stuff. So that was really, that was a very busy period for me. And then in September of '77, I was playing lead guitar on in the house band on a TV show with David Essex. And Denny Lane came on the show as a guest. And we did Go Now, the old Moody
blues song.
And they'd given a guitar solo to me. And Danny liked my playing, and apparently a few days later called up the musical director of the show and to find out if I was versatile, because Jimmy McCulloch had gone from Wings, and they were looking for somebody that could cover a lot of different styles. And Jimmy was a great rock and roll player, but he didn't play a lot of other stuff. Whereas as a studio musician, it was just in my day-to-day music making that I was covering a lot of different stylistic bases.
Well, you seem a man of deep thought, and it seems to transcend into your playing, like a very complex musician and a man of thought. And I found a quote of yours that really intrigued me. And you had said there's a charisma there, talking about Paul McCartney, that goes further than just the human being. There's a mythology that kind of resonates on many levels of your life. Can you talk about that a bit and what it was like, coming to know him and meet him as a man and as a myth?
I wonder what I was smoking when I said that. But I mean, it's true in terms of, Paul is a larger than life figure. And the Beatles, as musicians, as social icons, as mythological characters, really, and certainly my generation, the kind of the boomer generation, they had a profound effect because they not only introduced musical change, there was also a certain level of societal change that went along with that. So, it's really quite remarkable, so many years later, that you still have that resonance. You still have that, Beatles still have, that you can still listen to the music. It doesn't sound dated. It's still winning new fans. And it's really like kind of our generation's version of Shakespeare, as far as something that it doesn't go away, because the art has so much dimension to it. Which is not to say that there aren't certain Beatles songs that are just kind of like filler material, but there are other songs that are just on a very elevated artistic level. But Paul, having worked with Paul and being directly, having that direct experience of his workflow, his work ethic, his musical sensibility, and just how that all works, is something that made a very deep impression on me. I mean, I got my master's degree, my bachelor's degree from London University, and my master's degree from McCartney University is how I look at it.
Good way to put it. So I'm going to hand over to my friend Phil Weathers and let him take over here. Thank you for those answers.
Okay, Laurence, it's again, it's really great to get to talk to you. Notice that you've won 2 Grammy Awards. Can you tell us about winning the awards and also the 2 projects that you won them for?
Well, the first Grammy was, on the Back to the Egg album, we did the Rockestra theme, and that won the Grammy, the first Grammy ever awarded for rock instrumental. And that experience was a little strange because this was right after Paul had got busted in Tokyo. And when I left Tokyo after like 3 or 4 days of being there, because we were encouraged not to hang around, I went to LA for a little while, and then I went back to London. And I'm in London, and one day a box arrives in the mail, a little box arrives in the mail, and I open it up, and there's this thing that you had to put together, and I realized it was a Grammy. And I
Wow.
called up the office and I said, we won a Grammy. And they say, oh, yeah, we forgot to tell you. I mean, it was kind of a very understated experience. The second Grammy, which was about, now, what, 15 years ago or so, that was, I did an arrangement of the Pink Panther theme for a compilation album of Henry Mancini songs. And my tune was the first tune on the album. And that won a Grammy. And for that, I was actually at the ceremony, which was, and so there's that kind of moment where it gets announced and it's like, you really don't expect it.
Right.
I put on a tuxedo and went downtown LA, and most of the Grammys are awarded in categories that you don't see on television. There's a separate ceremony in the afternoon where they do, the kind of the non. Who was the announcer? Cyndi Lauper was the one who announced it. One of the cool things about that was that the row I was sitting with, and I looked behind me, and Sarah Vaughan was sitting behind me,
Wow.
who's one of the great jazz singers. So there's something kind of really cool about being in a community of creators who have, who share a common goal, who vote for each other and kind of support each other. But as time's gone on, I have to say, I mean, as a member of the Recording Academy, I find it harder and harder to vote. First round of voting, there's, in any one category, there could be 500 to 1,000 entries. And somehow that has to be whittled down to, you have to choose, 4 or 5 in each category, and it's not an easy process.
That's good.
But the fact is that having a Grammy, having Grammys, it looks good on the resume and on the mantle. But at the end of the day, the entertainment business is one where, what did you do last week, or what are you doing next week? It doesn't necessarily refer back to 30 years ago, for example.
Right. Well, thank you. I read somewhere, Laurence, that you never saw the Beatles perform live, but you did see Jimi Hendrix. Can you tell us about seeing Jimi and not seeing the Beatles?
Well, as far as the Beatles were concerned, I mean, I saw the Beatles a lot on television. Especially in 1963, they were on TV quite a bit. Although there was nothing quite like the train scene in A Hard Day's Night, where they're doing I Should Have Known Better in the train carriage. And that, I think, meant a lot more to my 11-year-old self than seeing them like lip syncing their songs on one of the TV shows.
Right.
But and also, the fact that the Beatles had stopped being a performing band, 1966, right before Jimi Hendrix came onto the scene in London. And I think that it was kind of, because you could never hear the Beatles anyway, and I, being a fan of the music, it was not so much just being there as I enjoyed the process of actually like hearing and watching the players, and especially if I could get up fairly close, because it was like having guitar lessons. In fact, my very first concert when I was 11 was Jerry and the Pacemakers and Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. In fact, every time I see Billy J, we still laugh about that. But Jimi Hendrix, I mean, I didn't see Jimi in a club environment. I saw him at the Albert Hall twice in early 1968. He did 2 concerts a week apart, and I was there for both.
Wow.
And that was, just a lifetime of guitar lessons right there.
Okay. Back to the Egg, the album. Of course, that's a solid album, a good album. And the critics only realized it sort of after after a period of time, your playing seems to move it along and is a big part of it. Can you talk a little bit about that album?
Well, it's kind of gratifying that the critics and the fans have actually kind of like, held on to that one. I think it's interesting, that album is credited to Wings, not to Paul McCartney and Wings. And in the making of it, there was one dimension of it was that it was very much a band album. It was a new band with me and Steve Holley joining, and that conceptually there was a little bit of a kind of a back to basics idea with it. You didn't have any of the more heavily produced tracks, with orchestras like Live and Let Die or My Love or stuff like that. It was more of a rootsy kind of record. And you have these, like Spin It On, which is one of my favorites, is really like a punk rockabilly song. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of dimension to that record. I think that Paul has a tendency to classify his albums on the basis of the hit singles, and that didn't have the hit singles from that period, like Good Night Tonight, for example, wasn't on the album.
Right.
So Paul has a slightly kind of different perspective on it. But over the years, I found that the fans have really embraced that album.
Right.
Songs are, the songs are fun to play live. So, when I do Wingmen gigs with Steve Holley and, sometimes with Denny Lane, being able to play those tunes seems to keep the fans happy, and it's fun to do. It was a great experience, and right. I was pleased that I was able to make a valuable lead guitar contribution to that record, and that there was the space to be able to do that. Paul was pretty gracious about giving me the freedom to bring my own contribution to it.
That's great. Okay, Laurence, thank you for those answers, and I'm going to turn it over to Warren.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate it. First of all, Laurence, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show, and it's very nice to speak with you. I got a question about the background that I can see in the video right now. Your pictures, you have a gold record there. Can you tell me what that gold record is?
That's for Back to the Egg. That's the American Back to the Egg gold. Actually, it's platinum. It's not gold.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that was for $1 million. That was when it hit the first $1 million.
Right.
And then there's some actually next to it, the picture next to it is Paul with the squeeze box playing when we were recording How Many Million Miles on Back to the Egg. And that was done outdoors. So he's playing this little concertina and singing and playing at the same time. And above it is a shot of Linda sitting at a Hammond B3 organ during the orchestra session.
Wow.
That's some great stuff.
On the other side, there's a picture of me during the filming of the Good Night Tonight video. And then next to that, of the lower one next to that is actually Paul and John with Mike McCartney's picture, and then above it is an award that I got at the Hollywood Music and Media Awards for my co-composing the score to a video game called Diablo 3.
Wow, that's good. And Diablo 3 is a good video. I played that before. And what is all them instruments down there?
Oh, that's just a little corner of my guitar collection. There's a Rickenbacker 12-string, two Stratocasters, a bunch, 335, and a bunch of acoustic guitars.
That's great. Awesome stuff there. And you have a Beatles blanket behind you too?
Yeah, there's a Sgt. Pepper blanket on my bench there.
Yeah, that's great. I like that. Looks pretty neat there. I thank you for all that. I appreciate it. You have several Beatles-related recordings. Will you please tell us about the latest and how your wife produced them? She must be quite talented, and I understand in many, many fields.
This latest one is my fourth. So first was LJ Plays the Beatles, then it was LJ Plays the Beatles Volume 2, then it was LJ Can't Stop Playing the Beatles, and then this latest one is the Fab Fourth. And do I have a copy of it here? I could show you, maybe not. Oh yeah, I do. There we go. Right there.
Good deal.
Yeah.
I like that.
And that kind of, basically what happened was back in the 90s, I had a few arrangements of Beatles songs In My Life, Martha, My Dear. And then, was it 98, somewhere around there, I did an arrangement of Rain for an album of mine the album's called Mosaic. And I did an arrangement of Rain, and Hope co-produced that record with me. And that particular arrangement turned out really well. And she said, you know, you should really do a whole album of Beatles. And the fans were asking for it. And I kept saying no, because I started off as a fingerstyle artist. I started off really being a composer, not an arranger. And so I was kind of reluctant to do it, but she said, well, if you don't do it for anybody else, do it for me. So I said, okay, I'll do it if you produce it. And so that's where it started. And that was Hope was just leaving.
Tell her I said hi. Or sorry, she's lying.
So I said, okay, well, you can be the producer and I'll do the arrangements and perform and record it. And so we did the first one, which was 20 years ago now. And it was very well received. Acoustic Guitar Magazine, it got voted one of the top 10 all-time acoustic guitar records. It was quite gratifying. And then at some point we had given it to Paul, and he said, well, what about Wings? And so at one point I did an album called One Wing, which was all kind of post-Beatles McCartney. And then it seemed logical to do a volume 2. So Hope had kind of been pushing for that. So we did that. And then it just kind of kept going because, you know, there's so many great Beatles songs. I mean, there's like 180 Beatle compositions.
Right.
And of course, not all of them lend themselves well to being played on solo guitar, but plenty of them do. And so it just became, you know, it kind of became a thing that I would arrange Beatles songs for solo guitar. And I don't know that I would do another one, although it's like I start looking at lists of Beatles songs. It's like, oh, that would be a cool one to do. Or that would be,
right.
You know, and the great thing, you know, as a student of Beatle music, the great thing really is the ability to dig into the granular detail of the songwriting, you know, in terms of the melody and the harmonies, and just how, especially with John's music, just how much there is to learn from the way that he wrote these songs. And, you know, doing an arrangement of I Am the Walrus or Strawberry Fields Forever or one of those is, you know, it's pretty challenging, but also very gratifying when all the music and the guitar, that kind of nexus of guitar and Beatle music comes together.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome stuff there.
But Hope's background is in theater and in comedy writing. You know, she's written plays. She and I have written some musicals together. Her dad was a writer and producer. So she grew up in a creative household, and we like working together. That was one of the things that I really gained from working with Paul and Linda, was how you can work together and have a successful marriage.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. And how did you meet her?
Oh, that's a long story. Short answer is I met her in New York at a comedy club called Catch a Rising Star in April of '81. It was love at first sight, and we were married the following March. The longer answer is in my book, Guitar with Wings.
Oh, great. That's great. I have to read that. I haven't read that yet, but I'm going to get in trouble for saying that on the air. But anyway,
that book has a lot of photos from the Back to the Egg sessions and my kind of narrative on how those sessions went down.
Yeah, that's great. I have to look into that. Thank you very much. Your incarnation of Wings rehearsed tug of war songs. How did that wind up a project without Wings?
Well, that was kind of a floating project. I mean, I think the idea was that we would kick around those tunes. I think the mistake was that we weren't doing it in a recording studio, that we were doing it in a rehearsal hall. And so we couldn't really kind of like demo the songs in the way that you would build the album. We were really approaching it more like, Wings as a rock band doing these songs that weren't really rock songs. And in that process, Paul had got together with George Martin, and George wanted it to be not to be a Wings album, but to be a Paul McCartney album and be able to bring in whatever players they felt like bringing in. Wings had really Wings in the course of the UK tour had really kind of started to evolve nicely as a rock and roll band. And Paul, having been busted in Tokyo and having moved the kids out of London, and they'd moved down to Peasmarsh, and they were really not at that point really wanting to do a world tour, which would have been on the cards. I mean, if Paul hadn't been busted in Tokyo, we probably would have toured in America in the summer of 1980 with a hit record, because Coming Up was a #1 record that summer. And I think that what you get, the dichotomy between the studio version of Coming Up on the McCartney 2 record, which was, Paul messing around with technology on his own, and then the live version by the band, which was the hit record, where the live version is really a rock dance record, whereas his studio version is kind of almost like in some respects, I mean, kind of a proto-electronica kind of thing. It kind of indicates that there was a split going on between kind of Paul's direction and the band's direction, and the reality was that he wasn't writing rock and roll songs; he was writing pop songs, and because he wasn't approaching Wings as a studio band, but as a live band, and there was no intention of doing any touring. I mean, they didn't tour again until the end of the '80s. So it really, I think, it was just that the Wings was kind of done. The timing it had run its course, and we were really into a new decade and with a different an evolving musical style for Paul that wasn't as band based as the Wings were. So I think that reasons or a significant one, but also Linda had pretty much had enough because she had 4 kids and had done the world touring thing, and it just wasn't really on her agenda.
Right, I can imagine.
I saw that coming. I'd already started to make connections in New York, and so in January of '81, I moved to New York. I was saying it worked out rather well.
Yeah, that's good. Sounds good. Well, John was gone and Paul had that experience of being detained in Japan. How did it affect Wings and Paul's desire to tour? I know you answered a little bit of that on your last comments, but can you go a little more into that?
I think that there was no desire to tour. I think that pretty much it, that it was really, it was from Tug of War onwards that became a studio project. And it's not like Paul didn't have a history of that having happened with the Beatles, where they gave up touring and it became a studio band.
Right.
I just regret the fact that because of that, there wasn't the opportunity to make a contribution to Tug of War in the same way that I had made the contribution to Back to the Egg. Because after all, my roots were in being a studio musician. And, from on the live side of things, I mean, that was a learning process for me. Not that I hadn't played live before, but playing on the level of playing with Paul gave me, I got a lot of insight into how that worked.
Right. How was that being on stage with Paul and seeing all them people out in the audience? What was that feeling like in the very first time you stepped on stage with him?
Oh, it was pretty awesome, but nerve-wracking and, a little scary. But, the fact is that I was there to do a job. And so, I had learned my parts and I played to the best of my ability. And as, as the gigs went on, the band got tighter and tighter and the shows got better and better. And, by the time we got to Glasgow in December of 79, we were really cooking.
Right. Well, I'm a drummer myself, and I think I would have froze being on stage with Paul. But that's me anyway. I got one last question, and I'm going to hand it back to the Bulldog and Phil. Please tell us about your current album, any shows and books, and where people can find you on the web. Then after that, hopefully you can play 3 or 4 songs for us.
Sure. The current album is the Fab Four. This, I think, is my 30th. Depends on how you count it. I've done a couple of albums that are duets with other players. I produced 4 albums for Al Stewart, and the first of those, Between the Wars, I'm featured. So it was really kind of like a joint album. But I've done, this close to 30 purely on my own. Not all of them are purely solo guitar, but that's kind of really become my thing. And when I perform live, it's just me solo. Typically, although more recently I've been playing a lot more electric guitar and playing around LA with various ensembles where I can, stretch out a bit more as an electric lead guitar player. All the information is on my website, laurencejuber.com, and that has my show dates. And there's also there's a link to my online store where I now have 4 guitar books with Hal Leonard, one of which is all Lennon-McCartney. The most recent one of those is called The Evolution of Fingerstyle Guitar, and it's more of a historical kind of classical collection. My photo memoir, Guitar with Wings, came out about 4 or 5 years ago. And that has all I mentioned earlier, that has all pictures from the Back to the Egg sessions and my story and my story post Wings too, as far as becoming a studio musician in LA and all the records and TV shows and movies and things that I played on. I've been very active in terms of live performance on the road over the last couple of decades. I'm really starting to cut back on that now. And that may actually be an enforced cutback given, what's going on with this virus affecting concerts and stuff. So, but I do enjoy getting out and performing, and all that stuff's on the website.
Okay,
That's great. That's great. I thank you very much for that. Now I'm going to hand it back to the Bulldog.
All right.
Well, we were just wondering, you'd promised to play 3 or 4 songs. We'd prefer 4. So as many as you're willing to play, we're happy. And we have a tradition of closing out the show at the end. I was wondering if, when the show closes, if you could do a little bit of the closing song from Abbey Road, the end, for us.
That I don't have an arrangement of, although I could probably pull up the music real quick and fake it. But I do have many, many Beatles songs under my fingers.
Well, any ones you want to pick, we're happy to hear and glad that you're playing them. So as soon as you're ready, our ears are open.
Let me give you something from the new album. Here's Back in the USSR.
All right. Great stuff. Great stuff.
You make it look easy, Laurence.
What's that?
I said you make it look easy.
It's not.
I'm sure it's not.
Okay. Let's see what else. Oh, let's do. How about Across the Universe?
Oh, awesome. right. Good job. Good job. Great stuff there, Laurence.
Well, thank you. Let me just do a quick tune-up.
I want you to know that we don't pay much for this personal concert.
Yeah, so I gathered.
I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Well, we do give free samples, you know.
That's great.
Okay, let's see where else. Let's see. How about this one?
Right.
Right.
Had me up and dancing on that one.
Oh, yeah. You can't do a better job than that. That was great, Laurence. I got a question for you, Laurence. You sort of got hands like I do, and I can't play a guitar because of my hands. My fingers just not aren't long enough.
Oh,
How
that there are 3-year-olds that you can find on YouTube that can play rings around me. The length of your fingers does not make a difference.
I can't get my hand around the neck far enough to get any of the notes correct.
Have you tried a ukulele?
Uh,
The
no, I haven't,
ukulele,
but
a
that would,
ukulele's small enough.
yeah, ukulele I could probably play.
You just want the very end, like the "and in the end" bit?
As much as you want to play.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to get into the whole guitar solo bit because that's just...
Whatever you play is great.
Okay. Okay, let's give it a go.
What kind of guitar are you playing there?
This is my signature model Martin. This is an OM21 LJ.
Very nice.
At a custom shop, so it's Cuban mahogany with high alpine Swiss spruce, and it's an amazing guitar.
It looks like it.
Okay, here we go. So the end. Let me do one more time without the rattles. Hang on.
Okay.
All right.
All right. All right. Good job.
Awesome. Wonderful.
Here's a shout out for Beatles magazine. It's what we need is more Beatles.
Great job. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much.